This is the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. Hello everyone, welcome to the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. My name is Angelica Celinska. I'm the founder of the Voice of Early Childhood and your host. And today I'm joined by Jacquelyn Davis, who is the founder and mum-in-chief of Clever Noodle. Thank you, Jacquelyn, for joining.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And I'm excited about all the work you're doing to help families know and learn more about early childhood.
Yes, and today we're specifically talking about dyslexia in early childhood, and we'll be discussing spotting the signs of dyslexia early, which is a really interesting topic. And I think there's not enough around this area at the moment. So it'd be great to discuss this. And Jacquelyn, if you could first introduce yourself a little bit more, because there's lots of things that you do in the education sector, isn't there? So it'd be great to hear from you.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I've been in education for about 30 years. I was a teacher. I was a school leader. I co-founded a high school in a low-income area in Washington, D.C. I've helped train principals across the country. So I've done a lot, but most of my work was in secondary education. Some of it was in elementary as well. And then when my own son struggled to read during the pandemic, and I saw what was going on, and I saw how far behind he was, I, over time, found that necessity is the mother of invention. And I needed a way to reach him, and I needed a way to help him. Turns out he is dyslexic, but he was not diagnosed, even though I had asked in kindergarten and first grade for him to be tested. And so I had to find ways to reach him. And I did it by creating tabletop games based on the brain science of how children learn to read for him. And they worked for him, and they worked for hundreds of other children. And so now I'm spreading them across the US and across the globe. We have a lot of people that we're working with in the UK, and the company is called Clever Noodle. And we're just so excited to be able to bring things to the world that will have impact on children.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's a fantastic project to be working on, especially, like I said at the beginning, it's an area that has not been kind of discussed enough. So, this is something that a lot of educators and especially families need support in. So just for context as well, actually, tell us where you are based and where you normally work, I guess.
I'm based in Washington, D.C., and that is where I live.
Okay, fantastic. So quite far away from where I am in the UK. And the time difference is quite different, isn't it? So at the moment it's midday here in the UK. What time is it now?
It's about 7 a.m. here. So it's early. I still have my cup of coffee sitting next to me. You may see me take a few sips.
It's so important to reach out internationally and globally, isn't it? And really connect with people from different countries, and in terms of education especially, share the different practices and approaches and perspectives. But also I was just going to say how committed you are recording at 7 a.m. So thank you.
No problem. I am happy to do it. And to your point about our being able to learn from each other, one of the reasons we transitioned our son to the British International School is because they knew how to teach reading. They were doing everything based on the science of reading. They were teaching phonemic awareness. They were teaching phonics. They had their books matching. The children would learn something, and then the book would match what they were learning so they could practice. Extraordinary commitment to deploying the science of reading in their curriculum and in their teaching. And so when we found out about them and spoke with them, I said to them at the end of first grade, our son is 2 years behind because he's dyslexic. He hadn't been diagnosed and he hadn't been served at all. And they said, it's no problem. We would love to have him. We appreciate knowing, and we'll do whatever we possibly can to get him there. And for me, this is such an incredibly powerful example because the principal, the teachers, the support services were all 100% focused on ensuring that he was going to become a confident and strong reader. And so what I saw in my own son's case is a kid that has dyslexia, pretty severe dyslexia, starts second grade 2 full grade levels behind and concludes third grade on grade level. And so we know it can be done. We see it. I saw it in my own child, seeing it firsthand, that a child that is very far behind, 2 years behind, can be fully caught up in reading on grade level by the end of third grade is my inspiration, because I know it can happen. And so I want it to happen for every child in the world, because we know it's possible. And we also know what to do to help our children. And sometimes we're just not doing it.
And unfortunately, a lot of the time, children with dyslexia, they are seen as not being able to progress to the same level as other children, and they're just automatically behind in so many different areas of their development, and not just subjects, I guess. And it's really unfortunate, because a lot of educators may almost kind of lose hope in those children, because they are struggling to, I guess, almost connect with them as well, and understand how they can support them. And that probably does come from that lack of perhaps awareness or belief or experience that they can progress to, a higher level and catch up, I guess, in a way as well.
Yeah. There's a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding about dyslexia. And I do think we know a lot more now than we knew 20 years ago. And it is really time that all of us catch up with the new information and the science and how we understand dyslexia. So dyslexia is a neural pathway learning difference. It means that the parts of the brain that help children learn to sound words out and to increase their fluency, which is the pace and speed at which the ease and speed at which they read, those parts of the brain, I like to explain it, are like an atrophied muscle. If you have a muscle and you're born with that muscle really weak, and then you never do anything to grow that muscle, you don't lift a weight. So, you're born with a stronger muscle. I'm born with a weaker arm muscle. You keep lifting the weight. I never lift the weight. So you're going to keep getting farther and farther and farther ahead with your strong arm muscle. And I'm going to stay at that same pace. And so the gap is going to just widen over time. But what we need to understand about dyslexia is we shouldn't think about it as like a permanent state where children can't progress. What's permanent about it is your muscle was born a bit weaker, right? But just like a muscle that's born weak in your arm, if you exercise it properly and you use the right weights and you get some coaching on how to build a strong muscle, over time, your arm is going to be strong enough to lift something heavy, right? It's going to be strong enough to hit a tennis ball. And I try to help people understand that dyslexia is the same way. Yes, it is a learning difference. Yes, someone will always have it. And yes, our children can progress to a level that they are reading very effectively at grade level with the right supports. So we need to have them diagnosed, and we need to have them supported in very specific ways that we now understand are necessary for dyslexic children to progress.
And I guess that's what I was saying earlier, in terms of having that understanding that you can do something about it. Like you were saying, it is a disability, but actually you can get children to a level where they are the same as other children. It just takes a lot more effort, doesn't it? And that's where
exactly
that
right.
comes in.
Yeah, that's exactly right. There is a literacy expert in the United States, Marianne Wolf, and she has a great book. And in her book, she says, for every regular reader, it takes maybe one time to practice and repeat something to really master it. For a dyslexic child, it may take 1,000 times. And so what we have to understand is the amount of practice opportunities, the amount of repetitive work is much more important and a much higher level for children with dyslexia, but they can do it. And so there's a lot of things that are critical for dyslexic children. One, we need to diagnose them earlier. So this is another myth. When I wanted to have our son tested and assessed in kindergarten, because I was seeing a lot of the indicators that worried me, I didn't at the time know that those were the indicators of dyslexia, but I did know that he was behind his peers and he wasn't keeping up. And so I began to be very curious and ask questions about, why is he behind? Why is he not mastering his alphabet? Why does he not remember it in sequence? Why doesn't he remember the sounds of the letters? All of those are actual indicators of possible dyslexia. They're not conclusive, but they're indicators. But when I ask all through kindergarten and all through first grade, what I was told is that you can't test children until third grade. Well, we know that's not accurate. We can test children effectively and screen them beginning in kindergarten. And if we did that, then we would have the information to know that we need to intervene more significantly, more robustly, early. And the earlier we intervene, the better off our kids are going to be. And then you have to intervene with the right supports.
Yeah, of course. And for those that don't know, what age is third grade?
Oh, I'm so sorry. Third grade is year 4.
Okay.
So around 9 years old.
Okay. So that's quite a big gap, between what you say, perhaps children in early years, in early childhood and kindergarten at 4 years old, 4 or 5 perhaps can be tested, but a lot of the time they're not until they're about 9.
Exactly right. So you can test and screen for dyslexia indicators at kindergarten. But there's a belief by many, unfortunately, and I think maybe because, this is where the science was a number of decades ago, there's a belief you actually can't test accurately until third grade. But if you wait until a child is 9 years old to understand if they have any reading challenges, it's extraordinarily late. And you ask another question about how do teachers respond to kids that really seem to be struggling. It's not just that they struggle academically, but their self-esteem is wrecked. Their belief in themselves, they're often anxious and depressed by that point. And so we see a lot more challenging behaviors start to manifest, from being sad to being down to being checked out to not believing in yourself. So very critical factors for a child's success are starting to also decline. And so it's a double whammy. And so another reason why it's so important to intervene early and provide support.
And I guess what a lot of people perhaps don't agree with in terms of that early intervention is because then it really is testing children perhaps before they have even learned to read and write, before they've really developed in literacy. And a lot of people would say, well, they're just still learning, they're still developing those skills, and they shouldn't need to be at a certain place developmentally just because they're a certain age. How do you feel about that?
So yes and no, right? And I think often things are more complex than just a simple black and white. You're 100% right that there are different paces for different children, right? Children progress and develop at different paces. And we don't expect our children to be incredibly strong, confident readers until third grade. So in kindergarten, they may not know any more than a bit of their letters. In first grade, they may be reading a very, very simple book with, a couple of words per page and a few sentences. And we can still screen for dyslexia in kindergarten because there are early warning signs, there are early indicators. So some of those things are, and again, I don't want to say these are 100% causal, but they're indicators to put you on alert that we should watch more. We should be more concerned about this child. We should provide more support so that we know that there are things we can do really early instead of just waiting. So some of the things are rhyming. If kids struggle with rhyming patterns, sat, cat, fat, and they struggle with that and they struggle with that repetition, they can't rhyme back, that's an indicator. Kids struggle with their colors, knowing what a color is, remembering the name of that color, being able to keep the colors clear. That's an indicator. If children really struggle with their alphabet and learning the names and the sounds of the letters, which they should be able to learn by 5. So if they're struggling with the names and the sounds of the letters and the sequence, that's another indicator. So these are almost like warning signs, right? It's like the smoke signal that says, watch this kid, give this kid more attention, give them early support. And what we also know from new research is that even with a dyslexic child, if we do for them what we know works for all children, heavy phonemic awareness, heavy phonics, we use the best science of reading curriculum, and our teachers are trained to teach children to read, that those dyslexic kids often don't end up presenting as dyslexic because their reading evens out. They may still struggle in some ways. They may always be a bit of a slower reader than a child that doesn't have dyslexia, but they will not fully present as a struggling reader to the same degree because they've been taught well from the beginning. So there's so much we can do in the beginning, and that's why it's so essential, your program on early childhood. We can give children the just basic curriculum that every child should get, which is based on the science of reading with phonemic awareness, with phonics, explicit structured literacy. And we can understand if there's early warning signs and give them more support, give them more attention, because we know that if we wait until 3rd grade, it is much harder to support the child. It is much more expensive to support the child. And by that point, the child's often really deflated, really down, really sad, has lost their self-confidence. And so then we have a kid that has many more issues that we're trying to address.
Yeah, like you were saying about self-esteem and things like that, it really does impact them, because reading and writing and, text is everywhere as part of our daily lives. So, if they can't read effectively, that affects pretty much everything, and their communication as well, I guess. So what I was going to pick up on what you mentioned earlier is the fact that it's about supporting children early and providing them with different interventions and, like you say, watching them closely. So it really isn't about diagnosing necessarily, but spotting those signs, like you say, and actually not labeling children, but just making sure that you support them more and you give them more of the support that they require, just like you would in any other area of development. And the same here for literacy, I guess. I was also going to ask, actually, you mentioned heavy phonics, that phrase. I've not heard that before. What exactly do you mean by that?
What do I mean by phonics or heavy phonics?
So
I might have just used the word
phonics.
heavy.
Yeah, and I guess it probably
it's just phonics.
Yeah,
just phonics.
So it probably links to what you said earlier as well, actually, explicit structured literacy. So in terms of that kind of structured literacy or structured phonics, for children who are in, I guess, what you call kindergarten, so perhaps 3-4 years old, maybe 5 years old, do you see that as something that they would be engaging in quite a lot? Or what about play-based kind of literacy and phonics? Because there's a lot of educators that would say, especially children, I guess, who are struggling with literacy, they may need a lot more of a play-based approach because they're already perhaps quite deflated, and losing confidence and interest.
I 100% believe in the power of play to help children learn to read. That's what we do. Clever Noodle is all about unleashing play for the power that it can be to help children learn to read. So I'm a big proponent of using play, using games. That's what I did for my own son when he was incredibly checked out and deflated and resistant to anything that looked like reading because he was really devastated and he was so far behind. I needed an access point. And so our access point with him became games. It became me creating board and card games that he loved and he had so much fun doing. At one point, he said to me, Mom, I know what you're doing. You're trying to teach me to read, but it's so much fun that it's okay.
Oh,
Apologies.
that's so nice that he was kind of up for it and it changed his perception of reading and thinking, oh no, she's trying to do this, what I don't like. Actually, it's fun and I am going to go with it.
Yeah, it was great when he said, because it was very cute. He said, Mom, I know what you're doing. You're trying to teach me to read, but it's okay because it's fun. And I was like, great, I have him. I have him willing to practice. And the more he practiced, the stronger he got. But the critical piece in this is you have to make sure that play is based on the science of reading, right? So we still have to make sure that what we're basing this play on is in fact aligned to what we know about the brain science of how kids learn to read. So let me give you a really clear example. My son was in a school that was using what we call in the States balanced literacy or whole word language, not phonics, not reading science, not phonemic awareness. And so they were playing, but they were playing with, rather than teaching the children, alligator is ah, ah, ah. And you could make it really fun. You could say, everybody stand up and say, alligator. Okay, what's the first letter? A. Okay, draw me an A with your body. Okay, who can draw the silliest A with your body? What sound does A make? Ah. Okay, so what is it? Oh, an alligator. Okay, show me an alligator. What else could it be? Oh, it's an apple. You can make it so much fun. But what we're doing there is we're teaching children sound letter correspondence and their phonics. But it can be fun. It can be dynamic. It can be silly. The difference is when someone's teaching whole language or balanced literacy, what they're often doing is saying, look at a picture and then guess those sounds. Look at a picture and guess that word from the context. Memorize the whole word. Don't sound it out. And so those are ineffective strategies, right? So play is fantastic. I'm a huge believer in play. Again, that's why we do what we do, is we bring learn to read games to the world, 100% aligned to the science of reading, because we believe you can have a great time and have something that's highly effective to help you move forward.
It is so important to make all learning fun for children. And I guess that's where educators and parents and families as well need to remember that in literacy especially, it's important to make it play-based and fun, because that's where children can become disinterested because of the sometimes the highly structured way that literacy can be presented or reading can be presented. And it actually is quite abstract as well, isn't it, for children? So in that play-based context, it's really a great way for children to be able to understand how it links to the world around them rather than just being an abstract letter or sound. And I was just going to say, I was just going to quickly say on the topic of letters rather than sounds and the kind of phonetics, a lot of families, so a lot of parents specifically, struggle with supporting their children's reading at the beginning because they're not sure of whether to introduce the kind of phonetics or the alphabet or the actual letters. So children do get confused because an A and an A is entirely different to them. That they don't really see hear that the fact that they don't have that understanding that they're the same thing, because they're not, are they? When you learn them, an A and an A sounds different. So, and that's what their awareness is. So what would you recommend in terms of parents supporting children's early reading? Perhaps to just completely ignore the letters for initially and just focus on the phonics?
So I'm often an and person, because I feel like we get into too many debates about or, and I think and is often the right way to go. So I think children need to learn the name of a letter and the sound of a letter. And there's a bit of debate about whether you introduce the sound first or whether you introduce the letter first as a name. The Montessori camp is more of the introduce the sound and then the letter's name. There are other camps that say introduce the name and then the sound. What I did with our son and what I think is good practice is to say, okay, what's this letter's name? A. And what sound does that letter make? Ah. Okay, what are words we can come up with that start with ah? Alligator, astronaut, apple. And so I think it's really helpful to teach children both. And I would prefer that you teach, 6 letters and really help the child come to understand that A is an A. A says its name is A, and it makes it sound as ah. B says its name is B, and B's sound is B. Right. So I think it's really important to teach children both because both are going to give them a set of critical tools to move forward. But the correspondence between the letter and its sound is critical. Children have to be able to make that correspondence and understand. We're actually working on a really fun puzzle right now that will be a giant floor puzzle, and it's going to work with children on their sound letter correspondence. And what I'm excited about is the art's beautiful. It's really fun. And it ensures children are learning. So again, to your play base, it's really important. But there is an argument often that if we teach phonics, we'll take the joy out of reading. Or if we teach phonics, we'll take the love out of reading. And what I say is no, because children who can't read don't love reading. They hate reading. Children who can't read don't find joy in reading. They find struggle. Yeah. So the best way to help children love reading is to teach them how to do it. Make sure they can do it well. And so I think, again, back to the play base, it's critical that we make learning fun for children and that we base it on the science that we know about how a child learns to read or learns math or anything else for that matter. Children learn to read until they are in year 4. After year 4, they read to learn. So if we want them to do a math word problem, they have to read. If we want them to read a drama script for their theater class, they have to read. If we want them to read the science experiment and write it up, they have to read. And so our school systems are all geared toward making sure children can learn to read by year 4. And then after year 4, they're reading to learn. That's the point in terms of what our structure looks like. And yet, many of our schools are not set up to do that.
Just quickly, I wanted to thank all the listeners for tuning into the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. Those of you who are regular listeners will know that a new episode comes out every Monday morning, ready for your commute, morning coffee, or that reflective start to the week to get you thinking and in the zone. If you haven't already done so, it would really help this podcast to keep going if you subscribe to the channel that you're listening on. The Voice of Early Childhood podcast can be found on 19 different podcast platforms and on YouTube. So it's highly likely that you, your friends, and colleagues can find it on your favorite streaming platform. So please do hit the subscribe button, and this will help us to keep putting out thought-provoking, reflective, and insightful episodes with a wide range of guests. Thank you. I'll let you get back to the episode now. Well, I guess perhaps it's also about ensuring that children have that love for learning more generally from the very beginning, so then they are interested in learning to read as well. So I guess it just all needs to come from very, very early on, the foundations of early childhood, even when they're babies, exposing them to books and ensuring that they do have that awareness and then that love for reading, even if that reading just looks like following pictures. So that love needs to come from pre-phonics, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, I call it a culture of reading. And we know that, so we know a couple things. We know that naturally children learn to speak the home language of the family. So that's a natural process, learning to speak, and they're going to absorb the home language. Learning to read is not a natural process. It is a learned skill that must be taught. And so we also know that the brain begins to develop in utero, the synapses and the neural pathways to read. And that by the time a child comes out of the womb at 0, that they are going to be in a position to begin this journey. And a lot of people think, oh, you have to wait till they're 3 or 4. No, you can start at 0 and build a culture of reading and build language with your child. And that could be as simple as reading a little story every night. As they get a little bit more advanced, you might say, oh, look at this Sally in this book. Sally is wearing a red dress. Look at Sally's hair. She has curly hair. So you're beginning a dialogue with the child about what they're reading. So they're beginning to observe. They're beginning to learn more vocabulary. Your children should see you reading. It's not just watching you be on your phone and modeling that. What we need our families to model is reading. The child needs to see this family reads. My mom's reading a cookbook. My mom's reading a magazine. My mom's reading a newspaper, because they need to see this as a habit and as a practice. And we can start having pretty sophisticated discussions with our children when they are very young, building their oral language, building their understanding of language, building syntax, how language is spoken, what's the structure of it. So we can do that from the very beginning. Very beginning. I did not know something that I now know and wish I had done. I thought as long as I read to my son every night, I was doing a good thing. So every night I read him a book from the time he was born. I would sit to put him to bed, and I would hold him, in my arms, and I would read him a little story, and then I would rock him, and then he would go to bed. What I now understand is, even in those very early years, I could have spoken to him as if he could respond even before he could respond. So even before he was verbal, I could have said the kinds of things I was mentioning. Oh, look at Sally. She has such a pretty dress. I like it. Oh, I love that she was so kind to Tom and gave him her flower. That's a kind thing to do. So you can be narrating and adding and pulling your child through that piece of literature with more explanation. You can say to them, what animal is your favorite on this page? Who do you like the best? They may not be able to say, oh, I like the dolphin best, and here's why, but they might be able to point, right? And then you say, I wonder why you liked that one the best. Once they're verbal and they can speak after, a year or so, they can say dolphin. And then you can say, why? Is it the color? Is it the shape? Blue. So you can begin to have dialogue, and that dialogue builds a love of language and an understanding of language.
And it's really about exposing them to all of this rich vocabulary, isn't it? And equipping them with all these tools so they can use them when they're ready. And like you say, also modeling the structure of language, syntax, etc. So they're constantly exposed to that, and they are always taking in information. It's just building up and up and up, isn't it, until they are ready to be able to, I guess, access it or share it and make it visible, because it's all in there anyway.
Well, the other thing I would say for dyslexic children, for any families or educators supporting children with dyslexia, audiobooks are incredible. Because if a child is in year 4, but the reading is level year 2, you can still have them listening to books that are equivalent to year 4 or even year 5 or year 6. And so that's what we did with our son. While he was so far behind and couldn't access the grade level text yet, we gave him grade level text and text above grade level that was, great stories on audiobook. And so where another child might have sat and read for 30 minutes, he sat and listened to his audiobook, and he carried that audiobook with him everywhere. He listened for hours. And so what happened is, when his reading skills finally came up to par, his vocabulary was already really moving well ahead. And so then the intersection was kind of like this takeoff point. because he had a lot of understanding of language and syntax and how language is structured. And he had a huge vocabulary from listening. So I think sometimes people are nervous. Is that cheating? Is that giving my kids something as an easy out? No, we want kids learning language, hearing rich language. And if they can't read it, audiobook is fine.
Yeah, and that's such a good point, because actually they're just going to fall more and more behind in other areas, and that vocabulary learning, and that's going to suffer if they're not exposed to enough language. And like you say, it doesn't have to be free reading if they can't read effectively. And actually it's not going to help them build that love for learning if they're forced to do something that they're really struggling at. It's important to upskill them in that and support them, but at the same time, like you said, focus on ways they can access that information, they can access that learning and those skills.
Our son, when he was finally officially tested for dyslexia, I thankfully had some very smart people who understood dyslexia explain to me the power of the audiobook. And so we spent a lot of first grade allowing him to sit and listen to an audiobook while I sat and read a newspaper or a book. And what was fascinating is when they actually tested him officially for dyslexia, his vocabulary was many years ahead of grade level, while his reading was many years behind grade level. But to your point, he hadn't suffered the lapse in learning the vocabulary and the language structure. And what we know is that kids that can't read get farther and farther and farther behind because they're here, or maybe even here. And the child that can read is going up, 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 up. And so that gap widens over time. And one of the ways to help prevent that gap widening is to make sure they are still reading, listening to audiobooks of those sophisticated text. And then obviously simultaneously doing the work to help build their skills so they can read effectively as well.
And it's vital to be able to also use technology in the right ways, isn't it? Like you say, audiobooks, it's a brilliant tool. And I know you mentioned earlier, we as adults, as educators, as family members, need to be modeling reading, whether it may be, like you mentioned before, through kind of cookbooks and things like that. But actually, even if we are modeling through the use of technology, it's important to make that explicit that we are using it for reading, so children also understand that that is what technology can be used for, and they can research online, they can look things up with you together, they can read on the internet and use technology for that. So it's just the future, isn't it? It's about using it in the correct way and exposing them to that and modeling it in that way, rather than kind of using a phone, for instance, or a laptop or an iPad, and not making it explicit that you are reading something, that you're researching. I guess it's just communicating all those things to children.
We also know, to your point about technology, there are some incredible technologies that really do help children who have dyslexia. One of them is voice to text. So our son, now in year 6, can very effectively sit down and write a strong paragraph or two on his own. But if he's trying to write a 5 or 6 paragraph essay, by the time he gets to that final paragraph, he's exhausted, because the cognitive lift for him is much more than for a child who does not have dyslexia. So the agreement with his teacher, which is great, is the first 2 or 3 paragraphs he writes on his own. He takes out his pencil, he writes it on paper, he does it independently, and he's building that muscle and building that stamina to do more. But then after a couple of paragraphs, he can raise his hand and he can dictate into the machine or into his iPad the voice to text, and then it prints it out, and then he can edit it. So it's still his thoughts, it's still his structure, and he still is editing the work. But the cognitive lift of having to write every word is mitigated, right? And is addressed. And the other thing that's really important is when he hits a point of exhaustion in work, his vocabulary goes down, because rather than try to figure out how to spell a sophisticated word, he'll choose a much lower level word because he can spell it. And so even the other day, he thought of the word expedited. And then he thought, I have no idea how to spell it. So he changed the word to fast. But a much better word, of course, is expedited, and he knew it. So, when he then has a voice to text, he's able to use the better word choice than a simple word because he's not so worried about the spelling. So there are absolutely technologies that can assist children and help them show their real knowledge and their real understanding of a subject without penalizing them because their reading is a more difficult skill.
Yeah, and it's important to not see that as cheating, I guess, or the easy way out, but actually as something that's an aid. And there's no point of letting a kind of forcing a child to struggle through that, because like you said, that they're not going to get anything out of it. Their enthusiasm and their energy levels are just going to go downhill from there anyway, especially if they're just struggling. So it's vital to be able to give them something that can support them and aid them to be the best they can, rather than get them to struggle and be like everybody else just because everyone else is doing it in a certain way.
Yeah, exactly. And it's important to understand where the work actually is, right? So the work for him in the example I was giving is the thinking work. It is coming up with a story, coming up with a sentence, coming up with the right word choices. If he says that into a machine and the program then puts it into a transcript and he can go edit it, that's not a cheating method. That's just him being aided, as you said, or assisted or accommodated to recognize that he does learn differently and that the speed at which he can do that is slower. And the cognitive lift is so much harder for him to write a 5-paragraph essay than it is for a child that doesn't have dyslexia to work through.
Yeah. And it's all about knowing what support is required, isn't it? And that just goes back to the beginning, what we were saying is spotting those signs early and understanding where the support is required, and just spotting the signs and knowing each individual learner or child and what support really does help them. And it's not necessarily the same as what another child with dyslexia may find useful. So it's really tapping into their individual learning needs, I guess, isn't it?
I think it's both. So 100% we have to tailor what we're doing for every child. Every child is different. Every child is going to have different places where they're developing a bit faster, a bit slower. And there is a lot we know about what dyslexic children need. And so we know if they're significantly behind, we need much more opportunity for them to practice. We need many more opportunities for an expert to work with them and review again and again. We know that they need a curriculum based on the science of reading, and that the teachers working with them or the experts understand how children learn to read effectively. And so, for many children, they need 3 to 4 times a week of intervention, either in a very small group that's a pullout or one-to-one. And a lot of our dyslexic children need that. They need, in the early grades, 3, sometimes 4, even sometimes 5 sessions a week. Like I said, small group, one-on-one, but it needs to be a pullout, and it needs to be very focused on the mechanics of reading. How do you sound a word out? What's the letter sound correspondence? How do you remember the alphabet? How do you start learning spelling patterns? How do you start learning that CH together is going to make the sound ch? It's going to be much. It's not such. And so teaching them the English language and helping them figure out its structure is incredibly important. And so there is a commonality of what dyslexic children need, while there's obviously individuality for each child, as too.
Okay, well, thank you, Jacquelyn. That was really, really interesting to hear that, especially with your own examples as well, your personal examples of your son. And it's so important to be able to hear those real life experiences, I guess, because there's so many people that can relate to that. And it's important for them, especially parents and carers, to not feel like they're on their own and actually someone else is or has been going through things like this. It's difficult to see, as you know, your child falling behind, not being able to catch up or not enjoy learning as much as other children around them. So
it's really painful. It's really painful. I say this to so many moms and dads and grandmothers and aunts and teachers who love children and are trying to support them. When I talk, it's almost like there's a moment of kindred spirit when you meet another mom who has a child with a learning difference, dyslexia or often even others, but there is an immediate moment of connection because we've all struggled. We've all felt the incredible pain of seeing someone you love so much and not knowing how to help them, not knowing what to do. And, we can't expect our parents to know how to teach our children reading. That's the job of the schools. And so we need our educators to have the right learning materials given to them and provided. And then we need them to be effectively trained in how to use those materials and truly teach children to read. They need to understand how children learn to read and teach accordingly so that they can support the kid. But it is both what inspires me and it is what frustrates me, is that we know what to do. We just need to do it for all the kids. And so I've seen it firsthand. I know the pain. I know the heartache when your child isn't succeeding. And I know it can get better. I know it can change as long as we spread the right information and we build capacity and we make sure that our kids are getting what they need. I mean, this month is International Dyslexia Month, and it's a critically important month because we can spread more information that's accurate and therefore help more children.
I guess we've probably mentioned it already. It's about being research informed, isn't it? And like you mentioned, like the science of reading, science of literacy. That's really vital, isn't it?
Yes. Yes. We've really known since the late 1990s, definitely into the early 2000s, there was a growing body of research around brain science and how children learn to read. And there was a disconnect often between what we were teaching in schools and what we actually knew scientifically that children needed to be effective readers. And that disconnect has remained. UK is actually ahead of us. So we in the United States are a decentralized system and we're very locally based. So if there's a big new idea in education, even when it's science-based, it's very hard to disseminate it across our country because we're very regionally based in education. Your country is more centralized. And so in 2006, you had a minister, Sir Rose, who did his own British panel to look at reading and literacy. And when the findings were similar to what we had in the States in 2000, you in the UK could act faster. You could change the curriculum more quickly. You could prepare teachers more quickly. And so you have been a bit ahead of being able to implement what we know works and what's based on the science than we have been in the United States.
And it's interesting that you say that in England we are kind of more ahead, and perhaps that is the case, but we still have so many debates and kind of conflicts around early literacy, and there's so many people that disagree with the different phonics programs and approaches. So it's an area that is constantly evolving, and like you say, just needs to be backed up by research, and we always need to be going back to research and also conducting new research, ensuring that we have up-to-date knowledge and we're constantly moving forward rather than staying stagnant and saying this is what we've always done and this has worked. Actually, perhaps maybe we should do some more research, and see what works best, or maybe apply different approaches together, and I guess be more open-minded and not stuck in our ways.
Well, I always say to parents when they say, I don't know if my kid's school is using the right curriculum, I say, go ask them what
Mm.
evidence base they have that that curriculum is an effective one. And they should be able to tell you, and then you should be able to go and look it up and see. But we need to do what is based on research and evidence, and we know works, and we know what works. We have a lot of information now. And so sometimes the debates are more about emotion, more about ideology, more about camps, and less about
Mhm.
what the actual research and evidence tells us that we should be aware of. If let's think about a surgeon, for example. So in 2000 in the United States,
Mhm.
our Congress commissioned a national reading panel, and they came
Mhm.
out with a large report that laid out the science of reading and the evidence and research base. We still haven't fully migrated to that. In fact, we're very far away from migrating in 2023. So 23 years, we've been knowing what we could do to help children. The evidence has been clear,
Mhm.
very strong research base. And yet, in many schools across our country, we are still not doing it. And so we're leaving our children in a terrible position. And so I compare it to the medical profession. If
Mhm.
if someone was a heart surgeon and there was breaking news in 2000 about what we have been doing on heart surgery was
Mhm.
incorrect. And in fact, it might hurt people. But if we do this other set of practices, we are going to save more lives. We are going to help more people. Would any of us tolerate going to the heart surgeon who's still using the practices from 1999 and didn't read the science and didn't know, and patients are coming out unhealthy rather than better? No, no one would say, oh, that's okay. The surgeon didn't read any of the research or the evidence. And, she's still operating like she did in 1998. And we don't expect her in 23 years to know what the new research is. That's okay. No, no
Mm.
one would say that. And so, for me, reading is life and death. Reading is whether you have a successful life or not. Reading, if you don't read at grade level by year 4, then you have a 4 times rate of dropout from high school. You have
Wow.
a enormous rate of ending up in the juvenile justice system, or
Mhm.
juvenile detention, and it far surpasses those children who are able to read. And so it is a life and death issue. It is an issue where you can't be an effective citizen. How do you vote if you can't read? How do you read about the current events to know how to vote if you can't read? How do you have a good job? So in many ways, it is life and death. It's not literally life and death, but in terms of your life outcomes and your life trajectory, it feels very
Mhm.
life and death. So I think we should approach it with the same urgency and the same commitment that we would have if our surgeons were using 23-year outdated practices and operating on people and putting their life at risk.
Mhm. And I think in terms of the context of the UK and England specifically, it's for us, it's about ensuring that the people that make the decisions, those that are kind of in power, the politicians, they listen to the educators, the specialists, the researchers, the academics, and ensure that the policies that they put into place are research informed and really are up to date. So I guess that's kind of the biggest disconnect
It's
that
a
we have here.
it's a great point because policymakers, legislatures should not be in a position where they are supporting a political debate around this. We call it in the United States the reading wars, and they're
Mm.
highly political in their camps. And I'm always amazed because it's like, what's the war? What's the battle? We have the evidence, we have the research. What are we having a battle about? What are we having a reading war about? What's this silly debate about? Why are we arguing about what to do with policy? We know. Follow the
Mhm.
science, follow the research, follow the evidence. The debate, you can debate all you want, but if you go out and say that tree is bright purple with yellow polka dots, it's just not factually accurate, right? You can debate it, you can have a battle, you can be political, but it's not accurate. And so I feel like, to your point, we have to use evidence. We have to use research and base our decisions on that.
Yeah. This is probably a good place to finish. Otherwise, this episode could go on and on. It's such a huge topic, isn't it? And now we're tapping into like the politics of it all. And it really is early literacy is that kind of topic that you can debate politically. So yeah, it just shows how complicated it all is beyond the research, actually. But yeah, thank you very much, Jacquelyn. It was brilliant talking to you. And like I said earlier, thank you for sharing your personal experiences as well. And that always is so valuable. And your article is on the Voice of Early Childhood website, so more can be accessed there. And I'm sure we will connect again. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.